Hi, my name is David Hilderman with the PPC Party of Canada, and I am honored to be here addressing you tonight, even though I wasn't invited to the debate. I'm an engineer and former Chief Operating Officer of TC Helicon. I obtained a Bachelor of Applied Science from the University of Regina in 1988 and have worked in the electronics industry ever since. Central Saanich has been my home for 21 years and is where my wife and I raised two wonderful children. I'm an engineer, and as an engineer, things have to make sense to me. The math has to work. Things have to add up. Over the last 18 months, one of the things that hasn't added up is why our government has ignored international studies that show a reduction in hospitalization and death from COVID through the use of ivermectin. It is being used as a standard early treatment in many nations, including Mexico. Why not save lives any way possible? Here's another one. Dr. Francis Christian, a 20-year practicing surgeon and clinical professor at the University of Saskatchewan, was fired from all teaching and leadership roles for having a press conference regarding the lack of information being given to parents about the risk of COVID vaccine in children. So what could this man possibly stand to gain for doing this press conference? Nothing. He was willing to risk his career to do what he thought was right. Now he is no longer employed by the university. What is going on? That sure doesn't make sense. And another one. In Canada, in the 12 months of 2019, accidents killed 22 times more children than 18 months of COVID. Suicide, 14 times more. Traffic accidents, 10 times more. And the flu and pneumonia, nearly twice as many deaths as from COVID. So if COVID is such a relatively minor risk in children, why the push to have them vaccinated? I am sure that the scientists that developed the COVID vaccines have not also invented time travel, so they can't know what will happen 2, 3, or 5 years after taking the vaccine. Why are we taking these risks with our children? The PPC is all about common sense. Things have to add up. So, okay, so the first question, what will you do to capture solar energy? The PPC party would not have any subsidies for anything to do solar energy. If an individual wants to put solar panels on their roof, that's fine. They can pay for it. They can put it on. I don't think that we should promote selling energy back to the grid because it can actually cause problems in the grid. If you have too much energy coming out of solar panels back into the grid, it can actually damage the grid. That's what's happening in Australia. And they had a promotional thing where people put solar panels on the roofs of their homes. People took the subsidies, put them on their homes. It was really successful, but it got too successful, caused problems with the grid, so they had to stop it. And the people that didn't put the solar panels on their roof then had to pay higher electricity prices to subsidize the ones that were putting it on their roofs. And it's usually the people that don't have the money to put those solar panels on their roofs that end up paying more. So I think a lot of these programs where you're subsidizing this stuff hurts the poor. Affordable housing. Well, housing, I better start the timer. Housing is a supply and demand issue. So the demand right now in Canada, the reason that we have housing demand that keeps going up every year is because of immigration. Now, immigration is good. You got to have some immigration. It's good for our economy, but I think we've been having too much. In 2000, we had about 200,000 people immigrating to Canada. In 2019, we had 315,000. So that's quite a big increase. That's a 50% increase. And right now, the government wants to increase that to 350. So that's something that we can do. We can reduce the demand for housing by reducing immigration a bit. Another thing that we can do is, and it's actually more of a municipal thing, zoning bylaws and regulations in building and the red tape to build things, that also increases costs, so that reduces the supply. So those are the two things that I think that we should really try to work on in all levels of government. Okay, next question is, do the rights of individuals supersede the needs of the community? I think that there are some rights that we just can't, I don't think you should play with that. I think right now the idea that we're going to have these vaccine passports, I think that's a little bit, I think that's going a little too far. Having a show me your papers kind of society to try to keep them safe. I think it's actually better for us to just deal with living with the pandemic and not create a society where we've got less freedoms. I'm concerned that future generations aren't going to have the freedom that I grew up with and that I was able to enjoy. Something that we just kind of took for granted. I think if we use these vaccine passports, it's going to be a slippery slope, and not too much longer we're going to really see our freedoms reduced. Okay. Climate emergency is causing drought. What are you going to do to help with this? We need to build infrastructure that can deal with the changing climate. So for the islands, Salt Spring Island and Pender Island and places where there's problems with water shortages, we have to somehow either build bigger reservoirs or if we have to maybe make a pipeline. I don't know what we have to do, but we need to deal with it because there's nothing that Canada can do to change atmospheric carbon dioxide levels. We are such a small part of the puzzle. And some of these things, like the Green Party wants to get rid of all fossil fuel production in Canada. Well, you know what that does? That damages the environment, because Canada has the best record as far as keeping the environment safe and protecting the environment when we do resource extraction of any country in the world. So if we don't do the oil, it's going to be done in a place like Russia, where they don't really do that much for the environment. They just get the oil out the cheapest way they possibly can and sell it. It's damaging the planet much more if we don't do the resource extraction here for fossil fuels than if we do. So what else? Yeah, so we need to deal with infrastructure. I don't think you should worry about reducing our carbon dioxide emissions. Next question. Electoral reform. Yes, this is an interesting one. The BC government did a referendum on electoral reform. The thing about that is that the system that they proposed to people was quite complicated. And I think people rejected it because it was such a complicated system. I think that if we're going to do electoral reform, we should do it in baby steps. Something like where you rate the candidates. Maybe you pick your top 3 candidates out of 5. So let's say you got 5 candidates, and each of the 5 candidates, one of the 5 candidates got 30%, the rest of them got under 30%. But a candidate that, let's say, got 20% got 80% of the number 2 vote. I think in that case, that candidate should probably win that election in that riding. I don't know what the formula would be, but I think something like that, something simple, and then do that. And if that works and it finds that it's actually results in better results in the election, then go with something like that and maybe go further with electoral reform after that. But I think a big change like they tried doing in BC was just a little too much. Okay, next question. How will you and your party address the population that isn't doing what they can to limit their CO2 output? Well, I just have to say that I really don't think that we have, there's nothing that we can do as far as the world global scale and changing the climate if we reduce our carbon dioxide emissions. I got to ask a question. If Canada went net zero right now, what would be the change in the climate in 100 years? Absolutely nothing. You can't measure it. If we would have went net zero 50 years ago, there'd be no difference in the world's climate. Canada does not make that much of a difference. China and India are increasing their carbon dioxide emissions equivalent to all of Canada's. So they're increasing theirs equivalent to all of our carbon dioxide emissions every 12 months. For us to destroy ourselves to try to save the world makes absolutely no sense. Okay. Actually, I had my timer screwed up, so I think I talked too long for a few of those questions. Okay, what's the next question? How to deal with the pandemic going forward, rights and costs. Wow. Well, our government spent like crazy during the pandemic. They threw money everywhere. I know somebody who has a small business that was not affected at all during the pandemic, and yet government had programs where they were able to get $300,000, and their accountant saw it and say, hey, we can get this money, we should apply for it. They got it. There was no reduction in staffing. Everything was fine. And I'm sure that this has happened all over the place. If the government's offering free money, businesses are going to take it. This is just an example, a small example of how messed up the reaction to the pandemic was. I don't think we should have had lockdowns. I think we should have followed the Great Barrington Declaration and done things more similar to Sweden or Florida. So that's costs. As far as rights go, I do not agree with vaccine passports. I think it's a violation of our rights. It violates the Constitution. And like I said, I grew up free, and I would like future generations to live free as well. Okay. What to do going forward with military spending so that when governments change, they are not canceled by successive governments. So that is a problem, right? It seems like every time the government changes from liberal to conservative, whatever military contracts that were signed get thrown out the window. I think that governments need to honor these contracts. Whatever government decided and did all the work to figure out what to buy, and the military figured out what to buy, whatever they pick, once that's done, those contracts should be honored. Okay. I'm trying to see, where's the next one that was to anybody? Where do I stand on the liberal rifle ban? I think it's ridiculous. I don't think it's going to do anything. It's not going to make Canadians safer at all. I think that guns that are used by criminals are usually acquired illegally, and it's not going to help anything. And $1 billion to do this program is pretty useless. I know somebody that teaches gun safety, and he said the list of assault rifles that they have there, basically you'd have two models of a gun. The brown model was still acceptable to use, and the black one wasn't. It's just kind of a ridiculous system, and I would completely repeal it. Indigenous land issues, how to go forward. I think that the recommendations in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission should be followed. More of those things should get implemented. I also think that we need to figure out a new relationship with First Nations, one where they can one that's not so paternalistic, and one that they can have some more respect for themselves in the way that they run their governments. So steps for climate change. This is the reason that I'm running in this election. It's mainly because I did a bunch of research on climate, and I discovered that we are not in an emergency. The Earth was warmer 1,000 years ago during the medieval warm period. It's warming. It is definitely warming, and the climate is changing, and we need to be able to deal with that. Canada does not create enough carbon dioxide emissions to make any difference in the world if we stopped all of our carbon dioxide emissions. And in order to do that, we'd have to give up a lot of wealth in our country. We would, our children will be much poorer. Everything will cost more. We won't be able to build things here because all manufacturing will go to countries where their energy costs are lower. So that's my story on climate. For, I guess, my closing remarks is that the PPC party does things that make sense. We are for common sense. We are not about ideology. We look at problems and we solve them, and that's what we want to do. So I hope that you would really consider voting for me in this next election. And yeah, thanks. I hope you actually sat through the whole video. Thanks. Bye.